right, well, thanks for everyone for being here. I'm Jamie Boone, Director of Government Affairs with the Consumer Technology Association, and we're ready to begin what is going to be my favorite panel of the day and what I think is one of the most exciting topics, which is drones. This is a space that is just growing astronomically, super exciting, all of these different kinds of positive uses for drones between wildfires or medical delivery or agriculture. So I'm really excited for this panel, and I hope you all are too. And I just want to put in a quick shameless plug for CTA's innovation movement. If you text drones to 52886, you can join us in our efforts to make sure that we maintain an innovative and forward-thinking industry. So again, that was drones to 52886. And with that, I'll quickly introduce our panel. We've got Gretchen West with Hogan Lovells. I said it right? Yeah. John Resnick with DJI, Greg McNeil with AirMap, and Hoot Gibson with the FAA. And I wrote those in the wrong order, so.
We raised our hands.
We all
So
it's like a Trump rally.
With that, I'll turn it over. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jamie. Can everybody hear me? All right, so I'm Gretchen West. I'm a senior advisor with Hogan Lovells Law Firm and a longtime drone advocate. And I'm going to moderate the panel today, so thank you all for being here for the last one of the day. Very exciting topic, talking about drones and policy. And so kind of format for the day, we'll do a little bit of talking up here, a little Q&A, but I want to turn it over to the audience pretty quickly because we want to get a sense of we want to talk about what you're interested in. So we're not going to wait to the end to do questions, so start thinking of them now. But first we're going to start off with some brief introductions. We have Mark Gibson, otherwise known as Hoot, who's the senior advisor for UAS for the FAA, and he's just going to take a minute to introduce himself.
Okay, like she said, Hoot Gibson, my background is I'm a retired Air Force fighter pilot. And of significance, I guess, out of that is that my last assignment was at the Pentagon. And as all of you know, we got very involved in using unmanned systems. And we had to kind of go through a culture change there. So I got to see that firsthand. We actually changed our type of pilot training because we were quickly outstripping our traditional pilots to fill the requirements. And then soon after that, we realized, at least I did, that this wasn't going to be a fad, this was the future. So we began working in 2007 in earnest with the FAA, and I retired from that position 1 Jan of 11. I've since done some consulting, aerospace, and stayed connected with the unmanned systems. I came back to town as the executive director of the Next Gen Institute, and then was selected for this position over at the FAA last September. I started, so I haven't been in the position all that long. It's a new position. It hadn't existed before, and so I am the senior advisor to the deputy, but really in that role I have several roles. One's across all lines of business where they touch UAS, and also kind of the up and out guy that from time to time they'll refer to it, especially the interagency. So I do quite a bit of work there with the interagency, and I can get into that in more depth later.
Great. Next up, we have Greg McNeil, who's a co-founder of AirMap.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is like coming home for me. I got married in Texas, so I'm a Texan by marriage. Tells you everything you need to know about my judgment, nothing about my birthright. I'm not wearing my boots. Shame on me. So co-founder of AirMap. AirMap provides safety solutions to integrate drones into the national airspace. So awareness tools for operators about where it's safe for them to operate, the ability of those operators to communicate their location with stakeholders like airports and manned aviation, and we're totally focused on using innovation to solve significant problems. My background, I am a professor of law and public policy at Pepperdine, and I've been involved in unmanned aircraft since about 2006, starting originally on the military side, and then transitioning around 2010 to focusing on commercial and consumer applications. And then when the FAA passed their Modernization and Reform Act in 2012, that's where things really started to take off, and I focused most of my attention on consumer and commercial UAS. AirMap is integrated now. Our software solutions are integrated now into about 85% of the unmanned aircraft that you see operating today, with a few more that we're announcing in the next few months. And so it's really good to be here, and looking forward to your questions.
Great. Up next, we have John Resnick, who's the policy lead for DJI.
Right. My name's John. I'm what's called a policy lead at DJI. We're one of the largest drone manufacturers in the world. And I work on the issues surrounding how these devices are going to be used. Rules, regulations, best practices, privacy issues. the whole gamut of different issues that we face in the industry right now. For my background, I'm a recovering television journalist. I, almost 3 years ago, started experimenting with drones for breaking television news coverage. And at that point, that was a very new concept. And because of that, our company, being a responsible company, wanted to know all the ins and outs of what it took to operate these. And that's where I found myself becoming really immersed in the whole regulatory system, the potential, the idea that there were a lot of places where there actually were no rules, and what that meant for operations in both a consumer and a commercial arena. So now, 2 years later, I developed a relationship with DJI as we were working on solving various problems with news gathering, and all of a sudden, here I am. It was a big career change for me, but I think that's one of the most exciting things we see about drones right now is so many people are being inspired by them and taking a big plunge and making a big change in their lives because they think they can do something. And I'm one of them.
Great. Before we start some of the questions, I just want to get a sense of the audience. So how many of you are actually drone flyers?
All right.
All right.
How many of you fly recreationally, just for fun? That's a lot of you. What about for business, for commercial purposes? Good amount. Well, first of all, we want to just kind of give a state of the industry, what's happening on the policy level with drones, with the FAA, and an industry perspective on what's happening. So I'm going to start with Hoot and just ask to kind of go over kind of high level, what's the FAA doing, what's going on with rulemaking, where are we, and then we'll turn it over to the others to talk a little bit about more of an industry perspective.
Okay, well, it looks like a pretty good number of you are familiar with what's been going on, but let me hit the wave tops like Gretchen mentioned. First of all, we put out the small rule, what's now known as the small rule for comments, the NPRM last fall. We've gotten that back. We're over 4,000 comments that we had to adjudicate, and that's coming to completion. So we're thinking we'll be out late spring, and it's still in process. Part of the comments that we got back were quite a bit on there ought to be another smaller class that would be safe for operation over folks. And so we've convened another Aviation Rule Committee, ARC, and it's in process right now. It's going to last about 30 days, and that's in conjunction with industry to eventually try to identify what we think those characteristics would look like and how the rule should, what it should include. That's due to the administrator on 1 April, and then it'll go out for the comment period as well. And so a couple significant events there. We're also making progress in fulfilling some of the research that we need through Pathfinder programs. We have one for Beyond Line of Sight that will cover a lot of things like rail inspection. BNSF is engaged in that, as are a number of other industries, but rail, power lines, pipelines, that kind of thing, to push us towards the beyond visual line of sight, which we recognize as kind of the grail of commercial operations. We also have CNN, who's involved in one of those for safe operations over folks, basically through the news side. We also have another company, Precision Hawk, not to push the products here, but they're involved in what we call extended visual line of sight, and that's really a focus on agriculture. And then most recently we have a Pathfinder. It's not so much pushing the science that way, but it has to do with protecting airports. We call it the detect and mitigate. We all know, and you've all read out there's concern about having these come in conflict with manned aircraft. So there's a number of things going on like that, and then we have some key events coming up throughout the spring and summer that we're still finalizing, but I think it's going to be exciting 12, 24, and 36 months, I can say that. And by the way, I think what's significant, and I want to make sure I drive this home, the administrator was here yesterday. First he came down, gave some opening remarks, and then ran what I thought was a really riveting panel himself. So the leadership at the FAA is well on board with this, and we are very engaged, hence my being here, hence my position being new. And Earl Lawrence, who's my counterpart, came on the same day, 21 September, and hopefully the plan is we're going to move the needle, but safely move the needle.
Could you talk just a little bit about the Section 333 process? Because that's the way that operators can fly commercially, just kind of high level. Not a lot of people raise their hands that are flying commercially, but for those that might be interested, could you just talk a little bit about that process?
Well, along the same line, how many of the commercial folks already have a 333 out here? There you go. Okay. He probably knows the process better than I do, but basically it was a way via the language that came out in 2012 that enabled us to look on a case-by-case basis to enable commercial operations once they walked us through their safety case and mitigation that we would enable them to operate commercially. One of the benefits I think that we'll see when the small rule comes out later that a number of those 333s will be accommodated by the small rule. It's not final yet, so we can't go into specifics, but I think once we get out the small rule, that's going to enable a lot of the commercial operations that had to come to us looking for 333 exemptions.
So if you're flying commercially without one, you probably should get one.
Yes.
All right, Greg, industry perspective, what's happening with Capitol Hill? And I know you just were testifying at a hearing last week. What are you seeing from an industry perspective?
So let me first start by saying that from the industry perspective, I think we've seen a lot of changes in the last year at the FAA. I used to be a big FAA critic, actually, sort of a year and a half, 2 years ago in my writing at Forbes. And I think what we've started to see in the last year is that the FAA has really started to understand the utility of these devices and started to find ways to open things up. But the challenge that any regulatory agency has is they're bound by statute and they're bound by procedures. And so if there's not a statutory basis on which the agency can act in a free way, most inside the agency are inclined to operate in the strict letter of the law. And so there's been a focus, I think, on industry to say, let's turn to Capitol Hill to try and free up some of the restrictions that the agency is facing. And so one of the best examples of that is that I testified on Thursday, as did a few others, about the creation of a micro category. So 4.4 pounds and below, basically the typical recreational UAS that you see. And the argument was, let's free up that category to fly in the same way that recreational operators can fly. So today, if you took one of John's devices, a DJI Phantom, it weighs about 3 pounds, and you wanted to fly it for recreational purposes, the rules are keep it below 400 feet, keep it within line of sight, and fly it within a set of community-based guidelines. And we took a look at that and we said it doesn't make much sense that you could go fly over a field and take pictures for fun, but the moment that you wanted to use those photographs to sell that real estate of the field that you were taking a picture of, that all of a sudden that became something that wasn't permissible. And so the argument that industry has been making on the Hill is let's free up solo entrepreneurs and small businesses to use that smallest, lightest weight category. And so there was testimony on the Hill about how that smallest category based on bird strike data, based on the weight of that smallest category, that we would have, I can't remember what it was, Adam's here, his colleague from Mercatus had the statistics. It would be like 1 in every 270,000 years or something. Right, there would be an accident that would result in a fatality from one of these devices flying. And so that micro rule picked up support in the House. We're hopeful now, and we're working with CTA to try and convince the Senate to also pick it up. So that's one of the positive developments that's going on that comes from the engagement of people who are deriving benefits from the technology. There are also some things that are less helpful that are floating their way around on the Hill that are sort of a step back. For example, the Part 107 operations that Hoot mentioned. Basically, the FAA made a decision that if you want to operate these devices, there's no airworthiness certification required. There's no set of industry consensus standards. Rather, the regulations would be fairly permissive. There's a section 2124 of the Senate bill that's pending now, is a bit of a step back from that says that all of these aircraft are now going to be subjected to a series of consensus standards that will look something like airworthiness, and so we're working to try and peel that back so we can free up innovation. And so that's a little bit of a view of what's going on the Hill. And I just kind of want to frame it to say why that's a bad thing, why too much regulation is burdensome. A year ago, AirMap my company barely existed as a company. 9 months ago, we went to our first manufacturer and we said, you should put this aeronautical data in your drone. Like, it would be great for people to know, like, where wildfires are and whether they're near an airport. And the response from that manufacturer was, nobody's really going to want that thing. 2 weeks later, people started flying into wildfires, interrupting firefighting operations. A week after that, we got a phone call that said, let's turn this on, let's integrate it. And now, 85% of the unmanned aircraft operating today have in them live updates about temporary flight restrictions and where are the airports and all of this information to make operators able to innovate. If this Senate bill passes, as a company, I wouldn't be able to deliver that safety critical software to manufacturers like DJI, 3D Robotics, Sci-Fi Works, and others, because I would have to go through a process first to prove that my software was worthy enough to be safety software. So we'd be sitting on the sidelines without being able to deliver innovative solutions while we waited for some approval. I don't think that fosters innovation or safety, and so we're hoping to try and keep the pace of innovation going, like the type of innovation you've seen in the cell phone industry, apply that to small unmanned aircraft.
What he said.
Sorry. I get excited.
No, I got to emphasize just how critical that really is. For us, you know, we innovate and we introduce, our product cycles are very quick. If you're familiar with DJI products, you know, the Phantom 1 is barely 3 years old, and we're now on the Phantom 4, which was introduced just this week. And that features technology like sense and avoid technology, really the first consumer drone to have sense and avoid technology. Everyone acknowledges that for drones to advance and move forward, sense and avoid is going to be a critical component of an overall safety system. And if we have to go through a process, so what Greg's describing, if we're living in a world like that, every time we wanted to make an update to that system, every time we wanted to make an improvement for that system, we would have to go through a bureaucratic regime in order to get it approved. So and for us, a lot of time, our product cycles are going to be faster than that bureaucratic regime. We could innovate it in 6 months, and we might have to wait another 6 months before we could put it on the shelf. So we don't think that really enhances safety, enhances innovation at all. The other side of that they mentioned, and the 333 process is I think there are a lot of lessons that to be gained from out of the 333 process, and really supports the micro rule, which we're trying to move forward. And people shouldn't get confused. There's a micro rule making body, which is specifically trying to learn about flying over people. And then there is a micro rule proposal on Capitol Hill. And the micro rule proposal at its very lowest level is supposed to be designed for the simplest of operations, away from people, away from big buildings and structures, not at night, really basic operations. And so we believe that to do that basic operation should be as little burdens to it as possible. We've seen in the 333 process, and you got some of you guys out here who did raise your hand that you're commercial but don't actually have a 333. The reason for that is because the 333 process is overly burdensome. The requirements in there do not make sense. And so right-thinking, normal people, some of them come to a point where they just say, you know what, I'm not going to be compliant. These rules are way excessive. And so they don't mean to be bad people. They don't mean to walk on the dark side. But it's almost like the government is backing them into a corner. And I really think that FAA is, especially with Hoot and Earl coming on board, there's a lot more recognition that if you create overly burdensome regulations, you're not going to necessarily enhance safety. You're going to actually potentially create a culture of not being safe, because people will say, you know what, that's just, it doesn't apply to me, I'm not even going to pay attention to it. So we think low burdens to entry, easy to understand rules is really the key to creating a culture of compliance.
So we've heard the word innovation a lot just in the last however many minutes we've been on this panel, and also bureaucracy. And so President Obama was here on Friday, and his talk was kind of about mixing innovation and policy, and how do we move forward as a country, kind of bringing technology with decision making, bringing that together. And this drone space is moving so rapidly, and like John said, I mean, they're developing new products all the time. Greg's team is developing new capabilities all the time. And so how do we as an industry work with the bureaucracy to bring some of this innovation? So from your perspective, how do we come to the FAA, and how does the FAA recognize that? Administrator Huertas said yesterday, he talked about innovation, and so I've seen a change in the FAA as well, as being much more open-minded to our industry. But how do we as industry participants also figure out how to bring this innovation into this decision-making instead of relying on historical manned aviation law to guide where we're going? I don't know who wants to start.
I think there have definitely been improvements over the past year in that regard. I think one of the words that always gets kicked around a lot is about taking a risk-based approach. And that is actually trying to measure what are the risks of something bad happening, and then figuring out what kind of technology you need to employ to mitigate that, if you need a technology at all. And for quite some time, we talked a lot about risk-based approach, but whether through politics or the general public, there was a sky is falling mentality, that drones are going to have to meet a higher standard of safety than at the highest level of manned aviation, and there are no people on board. So we're slowly coming to a point where we're saying more, no, we need to apply the realistic standards of what happened in aviation. It's bad for a drone manufacturer to say, but one day, somewhere, somehow, something will happen with a drone. So far it hasn't. So far it hasn't. The track record has been amazing. And to try to create a regulatory environment that ensures that that never, ever, ever happens is not possible, and really squashes innovation and squashes economic opportunity. So by truly embracing a risk-based approach, I think there's a lot more opportunity to get reasonable rules out there, and for companies like us to come up with really innovative solutions to solving the particular problem, like flying over people or flying at night or flying beyond line of sight. All those could have potential solutions that some of us haven't even thought of yet, and we want to make sure that continues.
I think on a lot of this, you have to ask yourself, what's the level of risk that we're willing to tolerate? So 750 people were killed last year with chainsaws. Any one of you could go to Home Depot and buy a chainsaw. You won't need to pass a chainsaw knowledge exam prior to using the chainsaw. You'll be able to use it. You can buy a bicycle. You can ride a bicycle on the roadway next to traffic that is speeding by you at 60 miles an hour. Thousands of people are killed on bicycles every year. If you were to swerve into traffic, you would create an accident, right? And what do we assume? We assume that the bicyclist is going to operate in a way that's not going to create an accident. We assume the drivers are going to follow the rules of the road. And we've created a low-risk category of device, bicycles, including, by the way, motorized bicycles. So NHTSA has the authority to regulate motor vehicles. Congress said, you know what, motor vehicles no longer have to be regulated by NHTSA if they are motorized bicycles. And we push that down to localized rules, to other rules that is not a federal bureaucracy that says get permission before creating one of these devices. I could make a really safe bicycle. Right? I could make a bicycle where there'd be zero chance of fatalities. It would look like an armored personnel carrier, but you'd be able to go out there and minimize the risk of injuries. But what we do is we make a decision about the acceptable level of risk. And so I want to circle back to one thing that you're going to hear a lot over the next few months, that we have to be careful about how we approach it, which is the idea of industry-based consensus standards. That is a really good thing for industry to circle up and create a set of safety standards. But the how it is implemented, the how of its implementation becomes really important. So right now, if you I'm on one of the industry standard bodies, the ASTM committee. If you gave us the perfectly drafted industry consensus standard, fully done, laid out, ready to go, and we dropped that on ASTM today, it would go to a committee. The committee would require 60 days of commentary from all of the committee members, the subcommittee members, who would then vote on it and we would modify it. Then once we made the modifications, it would go to the full committee for another 60 days of commentary and development. And so we'd really be looking at 4 to 6 months in the best case scenario before we were able to roll out whatever the new development was. That new development could be the sense and avoid technology, or a new form of prop guards, or the types of software that AirMap's developing that lets you avoid airports, or lets you let the airport or others know, if you choose to, that you're flying in that area, to let manned aviation know that you're near there. So we have to ask ourselves, do we want to go to government first for permission to innovate, to use Adam Thier's terms, or do we want to allow innovation to happen first and then allow the industry standards and rules to catch up afterwards? And I think that the pace of innovation, the history of innovation has shown us free up entrepreneurs and interesting people and scientists and engineers to do smart things and move as fast as they can, and then let the rule-making body catch up behind it. Let's allow innovation to take flight and create new safety mechanisms, new ways of solving policy problems. Right? Policy is only a way to solve societal problems. If you can solve societal problems without law or without policy and achieve the exact same objective, then it's better that we lead with the non-policy, non-legal approach, which is weird for a lawyer to say, but I really believe in that, having seen it.
So how do we do that with a culture of your bureaucracy where rulemaking happens in a very specific way?
It's not really my bureaucracy, but it may not sound like it up here, but John and Greg and Gretchen and I are friends, I think.
Yeah, no.
I
love
do.
This guy.
I love him.
I love this guy.
But I'm representing the FAA, and just a couple comments. First of all, we all put our families on airplanes, and we don't think twice about them arriving at their destination, and we've been doing that for decades. So we're very good at aviation safety, but we all know that that's more in the traditional line. And what we're witnessing now, having been a pilot myself for 30-plus years, is probably the most fundamental change in aviation in our life, right? I mean, it's not just some say jet engines, higher, faster. No, this is a very fundamental change. And so the key word here, I would say, is the way forward, is partnership. It is an entirely different pace. It is an entirely different type of aviation in many ways. And so the key to innovation for us is going to be that engagement with industry, engagement with academia, and frankly, also, we do want to stay abreast of our federal partners and how this is impacting on them as well. So that's the three partnerships I think are important. We also support innovation. I know that this is as much about jobs, economy, societal benefits, global leadership in this aviation sector as anyone else does. And and I got to tell you, the FAA is committed to finding the way forward. Greg did mention that there are a number of acts and statutes that are in place that you know, we can't circumvent them. We have to go around. But we're finding creative ways to move ahead. And I think, you know, again, that partnership is the way we're going to get there. It started out, I think, a little bit contested. And as I said, some new folks are on board. And I think there's a recognition now that the way we will get there and the way we will get there safely is going to be by a community.
I think there's definitely better recognition at the FAA right now about a lot of these issues. And, you know, part of the way that we're going to be able to do that is by kind of operating a little bit like we do in the manned aviation space. You know, there's not just a single rule that applies to all of manned aviation. It's really on a continuum. Whether you start out with an ultralight or a Cessna that's flying out in the middle of nowhere, their regulatory burdens and their equipage requirements and mitigation requirements are much lower. And as you want to do more advanced operations in more congested or dense areas, you need to then have enhanced standards in order to do those operations safely. So we need to always so there's a big difference between a guy who wants to do airliner inspections at Austin Airport here and a roofer who wants to fly below treetop level to do a study on the roof. So we need to come up with a kind of continuum of rules and what the requirement those aircrafts are going to be in order to assure a safe operation. It doesn't matter if you're commercial or recreational.
If I could just piggyback on that, you used the word continuum. I used spectrum, and I shouldn't have used that recently. But it is a continuum, and the longer you're around this, the more you realize. Again, at one end you have the traditional aviation, and meeting that was really where this started, like it often does, is military innovation. So we had the middle and large size class UAVs. that were entering, and we had to begin thinking about how to integrate them and how they operated. A lot of the backbone behind that was still traditional aviation communications and boxes and systems, but now you get all the way down through that spectrum all the way to retail, essentially, Best Buy products and then deliveries and Scan Eagles for inspections and that whole continuum. And for the FAA, many of those companies we've never had to deal with. I mean, the communication now are not the traditional AirInks and others, it's Qualcomm, Verizon, and AT&T.
Right.
And the same thing from the manufacturers. And so it's bringing in a whole entirely different group. And I know we talk about the operators, about kind of the uninitiated, if you will. Traditional aviation has its, accountability and certification and standards, but that was part of the registration. How do we engage with this community? As I tell everybody, they just wanted to go fly their kite. Yeah, but the kite can go to several thousand feet and can create a hazard. So how do we bring them on board? Most people, I'm certain, just want to do the right thing. They want to do it safely. So how do we bridge those differences? And as I said, it's not just the vehicles. It's all the infrastructure also tends to change that's behind the operations. It's a very complex thing, and we take our, frankly, public trust of safety very seriously. So innovate, but safely.
And I don't think so far people have been given enough credit to the educational aspect of that. If you think about it, 2 years ago, there was big concern everyone was going to get a drone for Christmas, so they started Know Before You Fly, which has a lot of good educational information about flying safely. This year, there were big concerns about a lot of drones being sold, and we developed a registration process. And right now, over 400,000 people have registered. And even with those huge numbers and the huge number of sales that we hear about, drones really aren't falling from the sky. We're not seeing drones. We've heard a lot of stories, but in fact, we have not seen a single actual documented case of a drone actually colliding with an aircraft. Whereas 2014, there were 13,000 bird strikes on aircraft. So I think a lot of it, the message is getting out there. And we need to be careful that that politically some folks might not be up to speed and they think we need to employ a harsher regulatory regime than necessary, when really the community and education are really kind of the backbones of why this has exploded so much as well.
So I'm going to pause for just a minute and see if there's any questions from the audience. We have one up in front? Here, actually, 1 second. We're bringing you a microphone.
I'm surrounded by lawyers.
I know.
We all have to apologize when we say we're lawyers.
I'm sorry, was that my outside voice?
So my question has to do with how you all see the federal versus state and local regulation question playing out, and in particular on the privacy issue, because that's kind of the big hurdle that we're facing here in Texas.
I defer to
Greg?
the Pepperdine lawyer.
Everybody defers to me on this one.
Well, no,
you go first.
Well, there are some things that are happening legislatively that we think are important. One of them is a concept called preemption. That is that the FAA has the final word about how the national airspace is managed. And so when you have states and localities that say want to pass a law that it's not about where you're taking off, pass laws about where you can fly. So a lot of people will say you can't fly 100 feet over a person's house, or 300. We've seen suggestions of over 300 feet, 400 feet. They've wanted to legislate that. Clearly, that is the FAA's area, and those laws should eventually be preempted. And in the reauthorization, there's a much more explicit statement about that from Congress on that. On privacy, we take part in the NTIA process, and the NTIA process is something going on right now in Washington, where it was ordered by President Obama, and it's designed to bring all kinds of stakeholders together to develop best practices for drones that include privacy. That process is ongoing, and at times it can become very challenging. Because I think one of the important concepts we have to get across when we start talking about local and state legislation on privacy, that we already have a lot of privacy laws. And we need to be very careful about making technology-specific privacy laws. So when if I can see it with a telescope, I can see it with a periscope, I can see it with binoculars, and all that, is against the law, if I'm invading your privacy, the same should apply to the drone. And it's not, you don't need separate legislation in order to apply it to someone operating a drone. But it's very challenging, and you see new legislation coming up all the time. There's also the very interesting concept, I'll let the law professor talk about it, of just how much airspace do you actually own over your house? That is a question that really has not been settled. Right now, nobody needs permission to fly over your house. That's how our whole aviation system works. Now people want to put that forward, and they're trying to put a hard number on what you have a right to. And that is a very fuzzy area, right?
Yeah, the administrator testified before Congress 2 weeks ago, and he said that within the FAA and with other stakeholders, that we need to have a conversation basically as a nation around this. Let me put my law professor hat on. I think the ideal way for this to play out is that on the unresolved issues, we probably need a uniform set of state laws that help to harmonize these issues. That lets you balance the sort of the privacy, the nuisance, the trespass concerns, while still allowing for innovation. Because as John mentioned, the question now of whether or not I could hover my drone at 5 feet above your property in your backyard is one that some will say is an unanswered one. I would think that would immediately get us into nuisance and perhaps the area of trespass. That's almost easier to answer the question if you start at 1 millimeter above the blade of grass in your backyard and go up to 5 feet. But if you ask me at 100 feet what the answer is, I really don't know. And if you feel like 100 feet is low, you should actually take a drone and fly it up to 100 feet and see whether or not you could see it, let alone hear it. And so the locational aspect of this, I think anyone who says that it can be easily resolved about how much airspace is owned over someone's property is really advocating more than they're trying to have the conversation. And then that plays into a bunch of other things because the locus of state law is grounded in a property rights approach. So when the state of Texas or the city of Austin chooses to legislate, for example, if the city of Austin wanted to pass an ordinance that says you cannot hover drones at windshield height over Congress, right, Congress Avenue, that would be grounded in state and local property rights and land use law. And then the question is that regulating airspace, which is preempted by Hoots Buddies, or is that something that's an area of core state control? I think rather than letting all these rules crop up in different places and having these fights about it, the better approach would be to have some model set of rules that we put in place where everyone collectively sort of has a sense about how to balance these concerns, because the locational thing plays into the privacy concerns that you're worried about, or the trespass and the nuisance concerns.
Yeah.
We haven't had that conversation yet.
And it is interesting, on the privacy front, we're having conversations, and there are ideas that are coming up that are not being applied to any of to cell phones. We don't apply them to all the surveillance cameras that are out here. People are looking at drones as different and having to meet a higher standard. And so, that's part of our work, is to try to explain in real terms what that can mean. And here, here in Texas, you have an interesting situation in that your drone laws actually specifically enumerate what operations you are allowed to do. And so that can be a real innovation crusher, because if you're not on the list, then you're not going to be legal in Texas. And every day, people come up with a new idea about how to use a drone every single day. And now in Texas, each year, the legislature gets together and adds to the list.
Mike, okay, just real quickly. From the FAA side, well, you guys get going, that's great. Anyway, our general counsel's put out information, and I didn't know if you had that, to help state and local folks understand what's gone before. And frankly, since the birth of aviation, we have been through this process about, folks flying too low and killing the chicken farm, and on and on and on. So years of case law to decide where we're at today. And yes, you do get everything from the top blade of the grass. What we call navigable airspace is above 200 feet. So if you're going to pitch a tower out here, you have to let us know about that, because it becomes a hazard. But there is a lot of discussion, and we're really out of the privacy discussion for the most part. We're just into the airspace regulatory piece and making sure that it doesn't significantly change the economic future of this industry, frankly.
And from an industry point of view, we don't feel like they were punting. That was a good idea. That's not what they specialize in. They specialize in keeping the skies safe. So it was a good move on the FAA's
So we have a question in the back.
Hey guys, thanks for being here today. So I was one of the ones who raised my hand saying I fly commercially, and I wanted to raise my hand saying I have my FAA 333 exemption. I've submitted it maybe 2.5 months ago, still waiting on an answer. And I actually have like my headset in my backpack. I'm becoming a pilot to get the FAA exemption. And I was at the panel yesterday with Administrator Huerta, who said that might become obsolete. Should I save my $10,000 and not become a pilot to fulfill the FAA requirements? And then my second part question, which is less important, with DJI, I kind of feel like I've been left in the dust. I was an early adopter. I bought the Phantom 1. Phantom 2 came out, bought that, and then it just keeps coming. Are you going to adopt a model where you do like more firmware upgrades, or is it just going to keep on continuing to have a whole new model? And
Let's start.
I'd love to hear that.
Let's start. Yeah, let's start with the FAA.
Sorry, John.
No,
Okay, well, obviously I'm not in a position to tell you to continue your private pilot license or not. But it'll be addressed in the rule that we keep talking about that hopefully is only a couple months away. The first part on the 333, I think the standard for us is 120 days to get processed. Now, part of that, you have to understand, I mean, we're the government, we didn't get bigger, and they were doing thousands of these. But not only that, it has to get on the docket. And at one point, we had 4 people, and I think down to a couple. They've since contracted that to clear the backhaul. I don't know where yours came in. It should have been about that time when they were plussing up. Did you get the current status, where yours is at or entered?
I hired a lawyer, so I haven't heard anything yet. So.
It's not billing you by the hour, I hope. Okay.
There's another one up front.
You've hired the wrong lawyer.
Yeah. Seriously, though, if you want to catch me afterwards, I can get some of your information. I should be able to give you an update. Okay.
I mean, so proposed Part 107, which we hear will come out in the late spring, won't require a pilot's license. However, it depends on how, I mean, this is just me dishing some like friendly business advice. It depends on how far you are into the process now on the sunk cost of it. It's not going to hurt you to have a pilot's license, especially if we end up getting to the place where more sophisticated operations require greater levels of aeronautical knowledge. It's also possible that the Part 107 aeronautical knowledge exam might be waived for individuals who have a pilot's license, in which case, when Part 107 comes out, you won't have to go through the aeronautical knowledge testing. You'll be granted the ability to operate so long as you comply with the requirements of Part 107. And so it depends on how deep into the process you are. But it does highlight something for someone who's thinking about it today. I think it'd be crazy to drop $10,000 on learning how to land a Cessna so you could fly a Phantom. I mean, the proportionality on that seems a little off, but I think it depends on how far into it you are.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Greg. I mean, you're right on the cusp right now. If the final rule does come out this spring or early summer, I don't know how much time you're going to have to actually benefit from having that 333. So, but not legal advice. In terms of us as a company, look, we believe that our success is predicated on relentlessly innovating. We put a tremendous amount of resources towards developing new products, new technologies, new ideas. And sometimes those can't be delivered in the old package. So, Phantom 2, all right, the Vision Plus 2. I had one of those. I loved it. It was great. But it used Wi-Fi technology to deliver a first-person view signal. We eventually developed our light bridge technology. It was much more robust. It provided high definition, but we couldn't retrofit that to the Phantom 2. So we really had to take another step forward. We do a lot of updates to our gear and via firmware, and we'll be doing that very soon with a big update on our geofencing, which is called Geo, and that's going to apply to everybody, and it's not a new buy or something like that. But for us, we're in business and we want to sell drones, so we got to keep kind of moving them out there. We always do it with an eye towards wanting it to be on the cutting edge, though. So that, look, you were an early adapter. We really appreciate that. There are more early the more innovative stuff we come up with, the more likely you're still going to keep buying it.
You forgot to talk price. The P3 Advanced 6 months ago was a $1,300 device, and now it's $499. I mean, like there's all this narrative out there about like you have to have a big, expensive, sophisticated system to be able to do amazing types of things. But what innovation is showing us is innovation plus competition, unbound by lots of regulations, lets this rapid iteration happen where the top of the line leading system 9 months ago is now $499, and it's almost as advanced as the system that just came out. That like lifts every boat. That is just a wonderful thing to let innovation be free that way and drive prices down. And so,
and that happens in virtually all technology classes, consumer technology classes. The early adopters.
But not manned aircraft.
No,
right?
not with
I mean, how long did it take you on a manned on an airliner to be able to use your iPhone in music mode? Do you remember, like, where you couldn't put it in airplane mode? It was like a 6-year process, and everybody cheated, and no planes crashed, right? There was a whole testing process that had to happen to clear that to happen. We want to avoid that. That's my sense of it.
All right, so any other questions from the audience? Adam.
I wasn't, like, looking at you like, hey, man.
Is there any update on the drone registration process? And last time I saw numbers, there seemed to be a whole heck of a lot of non-compliance. It seems like people either just ignoring.
No, John mentioned it earlier. We're over 400,000 now. And again, remember, that's individuals. A lot of them will have, 2 or 3 vehicles. I know everybody, wants to argue whether that's a majority or totality, but it's 400,000 that we couldn't reach before.
What I meant to ask is what the FAA sort of considers a benchmark of success in terms of sort of like the percentage of overall drone users. How many? It's probably going to be impossible to get 100%, compliance. But what is acceptable? I can't remember the last numbers I saw.
I haven't, frankly, I haven't heard any specific numbers because it's speculative. Who are we not reaching? How many have been sold? There were so many on the marketplace before. We had CES, now CTA, CTA. Came out with about 400K, they thought, around the holidays, but then folks thought there's 300 plus already out in the field. So it's uncertain. Like I said, we tend to look at it half full. There's 400,000 that weren't there before. And to John's point, we haven't had them falling out of the sky. We'd like to think part of that, we had a hand in.
All right, so we have another question right here.
So it's coming up on a year since the Pathfinder program was announced. Do you have any updates, like what has happened since then? Are we any closer to being able to adopt some of what the Pathfinder program was created to enhance?
Which Pathfinder
This is with CNN, BNSF Railroad.
Okay, those are all separate, but yes.
Any of the tech that they've been working on or research they've been doing?
BNSF, we're very close with them. They completed what we would call phase 1, and I recently sat with them, and we're beginning phase 2. There's quite a bit on the sense and avoid that's involved in phase 2, and I think will be very beneficial to everybody. I'm impressed that we talked about the partnership and working with industry. I've been very impressed with how cooperative, how intense the industry has become because they recognize the safety both from not having their inspectors out there, but the vehicle can do it better as far as sensing. We saw a derailment here recently. Right? Just in that business case alone, they were very committed to getting this done. And again, essentially all of it's been on their nickel. Precision Hawk, I met with them recently, and they're very excited. They continue to impress on their program. CNN got a little bit slower start because they hadn't been in this business for a while, but they're getting to pick it up now quite a bit. The last one is the one that I'm most engaged with, which is the detect and avoid, and I'd be happy to cover that in greater length. But there's a lot of interesting technology, and there is a lot of federal involvement in that right now. I had a chance to brief with the Secretary of Transportation recently, and I know it's getting elevated very quickly.
Any other questions? Sweet one right here.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's going on internationally with these issues. And a couple things pop out at me. One is that we don't want American companies to be at a disadvantage internationally with these regulations. And two, what are other countries doing as far as these regulations go? Is there anything that we could steal from or learn from?
Yeah, in a number of countries, I think you see some very positive efforts. Australia, Canada, Mexico have all embraced some version of a micro rule in order to try to ease and be innovative and ease people into it so that there's not an overly burdensome process. A lot of other countries, Europe is looking very hard at drone rules right now, and you have an interesting issue there in that you have the European Union and then you have individual member countries. And there's kind of push and pull going on between the EC and those member countries to kind of define drone rules. The whole idea, though, in Europe, and that's what we want, and in the United States is very analogous. We want to be able to have a consistent set of rules. Maybe it's stricter but we'd like it to be consistent, cross-border, so that operators know what they're going to be able to do and what they're not going to be able to do. It's the same thing that we want here in terms of states. To have a patchwork of rules from state to state or from country to country is not beneficial. Right now, the whole thing is really in a period of flux. The European Union is doing their big aviation package, they call it, which is very similar to our FAA reauthorization. And they say they want to have the framework for rules in place this summer and actually have it done in 2017. We'll see. There are a lot of different pressures going there. But then you also have individual countries like France, who, France has some decent drone laws. You can do beyond line of sight flying in France if you have the proper mitigators on your drone. So in some ways, the French feel like they're ahead of the curve on a regulatory environment. And if the European Union comes up with rules that they see as kind of regressing, they don't want to buy into that. They want to be seen as innovators. So there's going to be a lot of politics going on. There are a lot of different interests going on, and it's not resolved yet. The privacy issues in Europe could be trickier as well because of the kind of right to be forgotten and things like that.
So I would agree with that. The last part of John's statement about privacy is a bigger driver just because of the way the EU regulations are. One thing that is a very positive development that we've seen out of the FAA, again within the last year through Hoot and Earl Lawrence's leadership, is the adoption of starting to segment the permissible categories. So Congress gives us a statute that says small unmanned aircraft are 0 to 55 pounds, which puts the FAA in a box of having to treat that whole category as one. The FAA, we learned last week, is now starting to move towards segmenting up categories based on performance standards, based on categories of risk, in a way that when you look at the evolution from now, from the least risky category, a Category 1 UAS, all the way up to Category 6, you start to see that the regulations will map onto the category of risk, with 6 being like predators and reapers, things that we're not even thinking about, and then a lower end permissive category. How permissive we get that category largely depends on what happens, for example, in the micro UAS Aviation Rulemaking Committee and other rulemaking committees that are going to be stood up. And hopefully as the FAA continues to do this outreach, perhaps forming advisory committees and other sorts of industry regulator sort of meetups and collaborations, we'll start to see that America will really take the lead in forming regulation. That's my hope. And we've heard indications that that's the way it's going.
And the Europeans have done a decent job of outlining that segmented. They have an open category, it's called, which is kind of akin to our micro, then specific, and then a certified category. And they actually have, they've now also developing subcategories in there as well. It definitely makes it seem like it'd be more adaptable and more flexible, dependent on your operation. The whole idea should be a safe operation is a safe operation. So whatever tools you use to assure that safe operation, whether they're mechanical, operational, limiting, segregation, whatever, just let's get to a safe operation. And having those various categories can be pretty helpful. There's also an effort, kind of an international effort called JARIS, which is a coalition of national aviation bodies like the FAA. FAA is a member of that. And there are, I think, 50 of them now in JARIS. And their whole goal, the whole goal there is to try to have at least a harmonized framework of what drone rules could look like cross borders. Very akin to what they had to do with international airline travel. You know, it used to be each country had all their own rules, and eventually they had to come to a point where they coordinated their activities in order to benefit everyone. And that effort is nascent right now. They're having a big meeting in Madrid next month to lay out a bunch of ideas there, but it'll be interesting to see just how much JARIS is able to impact that.
So we only have a couple minutes, so I want to see if we can do one or two more questions, but I want Hoot to address this question.
Just 30 seconds. We at the FAA, well, not to speak for everybody, but we understand that we've been leaders in global aviation for a long time, but it's not a birthright. And so we stay engaged with all the global partners, if you will, on where they're at. I would remind everybody, though, we have probably one of the more complex national airspace systems of anybody, in particular general aviation. We have more general aviation than anybody else has to deal with, which is many times a natural conflict for UAVs, as smaller and the number of airports and so on and so forth. They're very dense, somewhat unique, and we've committed not to do the one-offs. I mean, we can go out and do the one-offs and keep everybody out and segregate the airspace and whatnot, but we're trying to build something that is truly integrated and scalable. And to that end, in my limited time in the Pentagon, in the building there at the FAA, we get visited quite often by our partners, and quietly they want to know where we're at and where we're going, because I think they know we're going to end up doing it right. And I did have a brief conversation last night at the reception with a major company, and he admitted that many cases they'd gone to other countries, but when it got too close to can we go turn the switch on and go commercial, but what's the FAA doing right now? So we're going to hold on to that.
We have a question in the back.
Hello. So this is a great discussion. I'm a pilot. I've been a pilot for 18 years, and I love all things aviation, including drones. And it's hard enough to see an airplane when you're flying. And I know a lot of pilots that fly at low levels over rural spaces. So this whole airspace separation, there needs to be more than just that. So we're actually, I'm the CEO of a company that's launching a competition for Sense and Avoid. And we're actually going to have the crowd participate in the design of that competition, so that I think, to the point of how do we get ahead of this with technology versus waiting for the first drone to slam into an airplane and then the regulatory environment comes hammering down. So we're working with some pretty sharp drone research folks to design that. Also participation with the crowd. And I'd just like to know from you guys, what are some things that we can be thinking about from an industry perspective, from a legal perspective, and from an FAA perspective as we design that, so that really the technology is leading this effort, and these, essentially we're able to have these craft, which I think we all support, playing in similar airspace.
Yeah, I think you're doing the right thing by starting from the point of departure where you say, we've got a good idea here, but I bet there are a lot of other people with a lot of good ideas, and to include them in the process. I'm amazed every time I go to one of these events. I learn from someone that they're working on a new thing that sounds like something that someone else was working on, but they're attacking the problem from a totally different direction. And I think that type of thing is the way that we continue to advance the technology that's necessary to create a safe national airspace system. And as Hoot mentioned, our goal in America is to have the integrated national airspace system, one that allows everyone to participate. And so I think the global, sort of arbitrage competition going on and regulatory arbitrage is actually a really helpful thing. The EASA guy comes in, or the Canadian tries to tell America that they're better, and that gets this old Air Force general riled up. And that's the exact kind of thing we want. And then we look to folks like you who are seeking to partner. And then on the legal side and the other things, to plug to plug Gretchen's firm, Hogan Lovells, they have a commercial drone alliance that's going to bring people together to do these types of things. So that's someone that you could reach out to. Consumer Technology Association also has a line right into like dozens of companies that are trying to work on new technology and to work on safety solutions. And so there are those few little nodes that you can reach out to, and then the next thing you know, you're connected to an entire industry of people.
Yeah, I mean, very best of luck to you, man. I mean, that's what we try to inspire, exactly what you're doing. That's why we have a software developer kit, so that we don't think we have a monopoly on good ideas. We think there are a ton of folks out there who have some stuff that we've never even conceived of. And we just try to be able to give people the tools they need in order to enhance that creativity. So good luck, man.
All right, so one more quick one, and then we'll need to wrap up.
Had a quick question on lobbying efforts. Are there any particular congressmen or senators that we can lobby? We have a similar, I'm in New York City. We run the Bronx Zoo, the Central Park Zoo, so we can fly over our properties. We have enough space. And we have council members that are pro-drone, against drone. But if there's any like key lawmakers that could hear from the drone community, flying community, who would they be?
Anyone on the, right now, anyone on the Senate Commerce Committee. So your nearest senator on that would be Senator Booker in New Jersey. Nelson's on the committee. So Senate Commerce and then House Transportation are the two important committees there. Although, as Hoot will tell you, from the interagency process, there are all kinds of other people who are stakeholders as well, Homeland Security and others, depending on the particular issue that you're dealing with. I testified last week before Small Business and Entrepreneurship, who had an interest very much aligned with the types of the themes we're talking about, sponsoring innovation, fostering innovation, that type of thing. But right now, all the action's at Senate Commerce.
All right, so time to wrap up. Thank you all for being here. I just want one last comment from the panel. Like, we're all putting a lot of time and money into fighting this issue and making it successful, because we all see the promise of drones in the future. And so I just want to get, very quickly, what is your vision of the future? What is the best commercial drone application that you see coming out?
Ooh.
Well, as you know, we do not discuss our research and development. Look, I know this sounds hacky, but I think the amazing thing about this industry is that if someone can tell you where it's going to be 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, they don't know. We work with so many different technologies and so much different stuff to try to see where it might take us. We don't necessarily have a specific goal in mind. So anyone who tells you they have a crystal ball about how our drone world is going to be working in 5 years, I think that's not the case. We know there's going to be a huge amount of innovation, and it's going to be awesome, but how exactly it turns out, I don't know.
Greg, what about you?
In 10 years, you'll be able to walk out of your home somewhere, open up Uber, and hail a flying car to pick you up. And we laugh. I'm not saying it'll happen in America, but it will happen somewhere. If you can deliver a package, you can deliver a person. Today on the battlefield, there's technology where a helicopter will autonomously fly out to a location and deliver logistics supplies to troopers in the field. We'll probably see it in China first, but 10 years, you'll hail a flying car to get to where you want to go in some country in the world.
Who, you got one?
No, I'm pleasantly surprised, having watched this industry for a long time. Every day come to work and watch the industry. It's always a pleasant surprise. I just encourage all of you to bury your own time capsule and see how close you get 5 years from now. I'm guessing not very.
All right, so anyway, thank you to Hoot, Greg, and John, and thank you all for the great discussion today.
I have to run.